It's Rachel. Christmas is just around the corner, the weather outside is terrible, and the seed catalogs are arriving, and that means that it's time for me to sit down, plan out next year's garden, check my seed inventory, and see if there's anything that I need to pick up. I just finished my full garden plan for next year, and I'm going to share these scaled layouts for each of my garden beds for what I'm growing in the main season, and then I will also show a quick design of what I'm going to be growing in a few of the beds for late fall as well as for winter. I did a prior video on how I designed my garden rotation. I grow a lot of plants in the Solanaceous family like tomatoes, peppers, and potatoes, and those can be prone to soil diseases, so I designed a 10-year rotation with plentiful use of cover crops to protect my soil health, and consequently I have 10 growing beds. For reference, the beds are about 7 feet deep with a 2-foot aisle down the middle, so that leaves 2.5 foot wide growing areas, and then the beds are just under 23 feet long. Here is a zoomed out view of where each bed is placed in the garden in 2024. The colors that you see here and throughout this video represent plant families tied to the legend at right. I use this color coding to easily spot when I've got a big concentration of one family and maybe risking my soil health. I did a separate video on planning for a winter garden where I shared that 2 of the beds are then used for late fall crops, marked here in green as November beds, and then 3 of them are used for winter crops, marked in blue as December beds. Let's get into the detailed layouts, including the 3 beds where I grow Solanaceous crops. I'll start with those, and bed number 1 is first. Looking at bed 1, the entire bed is underplanted with a mustard cover crop to help with soil fumigation, pollinator support, and pest confusion. The north half of this bed will have a curved cattle panel trellis with the 2 sides, shown here as dashed black lines, placed along its outer edges, and some heat-tolerant greens like chard or beet greens tucked along the edges. I'll start a crop of spring peas on those trellises in late March, not just for the peas, but to add a boost of nitrogen in the soil. And then in the summer, I will add indeterminate tomatoes onto the trellis, 4 for fresh eating and 7 for canning, as well as a few watermelon and melon plants, mixed with pole beans to add even more nitrogen back to the soil and to give me a crop of dried beans. The south half has determinate tomatoes growing on a shorter nylon netting trellis running along its north edge, interspersed with some soybeans, and then the south edge has 12 bell pepper plants and even more soybeans. I am not going to trellis my spaghetti squash after what happened this year in 2023, and instead I plan to grow 2 to 3 of them on the ground nestled below the mustard cover crop and hopefully safer from pests. The other 2 beds where I'm growing Solanaceous plants have the same layout as each other. The only difference is that after the summer crops are harvested, what I call bed 9 will become one of my 3 December beds that I use to grow food for winter harvests, and the one I call bed 6 is going to be planted with overwintering carrots to be used in 2025 as an early spring bed. The layout for these 2 beds is very similar to the south half of bed number 1, but for these 2 beds, the soybeans have been replaced with some bush beans for fresh eating and a larger number of bush types for dried beans. A quick note on why I choose these specific tomato varieties for canning: Moscovich, Early Annie, Orange Roma, and Sunset's Red Horizon. They're all shorter season varieties. They will reach full maturity in about 60 to 70 days. That's about 2 weeks sooner than more traditional canning types like your Romas or your San Marzanos. Because all 3 of my tomato bearing beds are either used for December crops or planted with stuff to get harvested next spring, I need those tomatoes to be out and finished by the end of July in order to then get the winter stuff or the following spring stuff into the ground by mid-August. With the shorter maturing varieties, there's a lot more wiggle room in my schedule in case something gets delayed or goes wrong, because something always goes wrong, and it allows me to make sure that I can still get those tight cycles in without running out of time or cutting short my tomato harvest. Moving on to some simpler beds, I have 1 bed that is planted entirely with sweet potatoes. I number that as bed number 2. I plan to grow the Georgia Jet variety this coming year. This bed is planted with a clover cover crop first thing in the spring. I'll plant the sweet potato slips into it, and then when I harvest the sweet potatoes in September, I will dig that clover under and get it into the soil to break down to give the soil a nitrogen boost before next year when it'll have some kind of heavy feeder broccoli growing in it. Speaking of, here's the next bed in the rotation, bed 3, my broccoli bed. Both sides of this one are grown under insect row cover to protect from cabbage moths. My plan is to grow 1 crop of green magic broccoli in the spring because it has good heat resistance, underplant that with a cover crop mix of mustard and clover. I will dig in that cover crop when I harvest the spring broccoli tarp it all for a couple of weeks, and then put in a fall crop of Umpqua variety broccoli. That'll go in about the third week of August, and then later I will plant garlic alongside down the aisle in the middle. I'll use that same cover crop under the fall broccoli, terminate it by crimping it when I harvest the fall broccoli. I can only do that if I avoid the garlic, but I'm pretty sure I can. And then I will heavily mulch over that crimped cover crop and the garlic with leaves for over the winter. The next year is another simple bed. I leave the garlic undisturbed along the aisles, and I plant potatoes in 2 long trenches down each half of the bed, healing those up as they grow. I'll harvest those potatoes gradually as I need them, likely starting in mid-September, and I'll harvest the garlic all at once, probably also in mid-September. I'll add a mustard, rye, and field pea cover crop in mid-August. Some of that will be disturbed as I harvest out potatoes, but anything that remains I will crimp down after the potato vines die off in our October frosts, and then I'll heavily mulch the bed with leaves, much like I do the broccoli bed. Going back to a couple of more complicated beds, what I number as beds 5 and 7 are the beds that I use for my spring crops and my fall crops. Bed 7 I call my early spring bed. You can kind of see a bunch of these plants behind me in the greenhouse. These are waiting to go into that bed. So I grow them to kind of small size, and then I pop them in the greenhouse over the winter to keep them from completely dying off in our super cold weather that comes in January. But these can go into the ground as soon as the soil can be worked, and they will immediately resume growth, so I get an earlier crop. The north half of bed 7 has those overwintered carrots I mentioned before down the center, and then I'll tuck Balboa, arugula, perpetual spinach chard, purple bok choy, and giant red mustard along the edges. The south half of the early spring bed is grown under row cover to protect it from cabbage moths, just like the broccoli bed. This half of the bed has a mix of scarlet and Scotch curly kales, Sorrento Rob, and purple of Sicily cauliflower. All of those are underplanted with clover and mustard, and I'll dig that cover crop in after I harvest out the spring crops from that bed, and I'll tarp it for a couple of weeks before converting it to one of my November beds. Bed 5 has similar spring crops, but I don't plant that until the spring comes along. This lets me harvest out my spring crops over a longer window. I've got the early bed and then what I call the late spring bed. As the temperatures heat up, a lot of things can start bolting, and it's nice to get this variety of maturity dates because I'm more likely to not be harvesting everything right when it's super hot and everything suddenly goes sideways. The north half of bed 5, my late spring bed, will have 2 rows of rainbow blend carrots in the middle, with arugula chard and spinach towards the edges. The south half of the bed has kale down the middle, and much like bed 7, this is covered with row cover to keep off cabbage moths. And then I'll have lettuce and beets just outside that cover, easily accessible along the edges. I'll underplant both halves of the bed with clover and mustard, probably except for just around the carrots, and I'll use that mustard to create some shade for the salad greens to delay bolting. I'll dig that cover crop in at the end of July and let it decompose under a tarp for 2 to 3 weeks before putting in my November bed crops. Bed 8 is nothing but onions, so not a whole lot to share here, other than this year, for the first time, I'm going to try and start them from seed and grow them up to sort of an onion set size before transplanting them out in the garden. Stay tuned if that works at all. I will spend more time talking about the cover crop blend that's going to go in here. You wouldn't think onions would need a cover crop, and they really don't, but right after I harvest these, I'm going to be planting it with my December bed. And when you look at that plan in a minute, you'll see that there's a lot of heavy feeders in the mix, and I do want to boost the soil nitrogen before that becomes a December bed. Next year, spring, summer, this becomes bed 9, one of my tomato growing and pepper growing beds. And I would also consequently, in addition to wanting that nitrogen, I'd like to fumigate the soil a little bit. And so for the onion bed, my plan is to sow a clover cover crop first thing in the spring, try and get that a chance to establish a little bit, tuck in my onion sets amongst that, and then later in the season I will overseed it with some mustard and add that to my clover. The reason I'm not going to put them all in at the same time is that unlike salad greens where the mustard comes up and the shade is really helpful to delay bolting, onions bulb up in response to changes in day length. Consequently, you really don't want something shading out your onions or they just won't bulb up. If I delay the mustard and I sow it in later in the season, the onions have a chance to get up and tall enough to be above it such that when the mustard does start to grow, it won't screw with their bulbing and sizing up. Both of those cover crops, like the other beds, will be dug under when I harvest out the onions and tarped for 2 to 3 weeks before I then plant my December crops. The 10th bed is fallow. It's literally empty. I'm just going to use cover crops in it, recover the soil. There's not much to show there. I'm gonna move on instead to sharing the late fall or November beds and the layouts for my winter, or what I call December beds. I did a prior video, as I mentioned, on the winter garden. I've adjusted these layouts a little bit since I did that video, so I wanted to share the updated version with you all quickly. The November beds are shown here. They have crops that'll survive down to about 20 degrees Fahrenheit or -7 Celsius. And then there are a couple things that are even more cold hardy than that, but I put them in this bed because they require pollination. So things like fava beans are in here, or peas. Those have to be grown without row cover, and my December beds are all under row cover. So even though there's a couple things in here that'll be cold hardy all the way into the winter, I go ahead and put them in this bed so that they don't get covered up. Bear in mind that my late fall and winter beds, even though they're meant for harvest really late in the season, they have to get planted in August. And so as I was working on these layouts, I did have to think about how to manage hot weather and how to use microclimates to my advantage. For this, I've used trellises where I'm going to grow fall peas. I've put those in a place where they cast shade on bolting prone things like arugula or spinach, so I can tuck those on the north shady side of those trellises. And then things that want or could tolerate full sun, so think fava beans, radish, bok choy, I'll go on the south sides of those trellises. The December beds are shown here. They hold crops that can survive down to about 10 degrees Fahrenheit or -12 Celsius. This whole bed, as I mentioned, is grown under row cover to protect from cabbage moths because a lot of these are brassicas. The taller crops like Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and kale are placed down the middle at the highest point of the cover. And then shorter greens like lettuce, tatsoi, and chard go along the edges. Note that even though I'm calling these December beds, I don't have to wait until December to harvest them. As long as it is still more than 10 hours of daylight, which for me is until mid-November, I can harvest out of these beds all through September, October, and they will be kind of a cut and come again crop. The Brussels I'm gonna leave alone, but things like the salad greens, I will get multiple harvests off of them. The point is with this bed that as November comes along, I'll stop harvesting out of it, let everything get as big as it can get by the middle of November, and then essentially I've got a fixed inventory of plants that I can harvest in those beds, and as I harvest, they don't come back. It just kind of draws down the inventory. That's why I want 3 of the December beds versus only 2 of the November beds. The November bed stuff will kind of come back for me multiple times and then eventually just be killed by the cold. That is the full garden plan for 2024. Hope it was helpful. Take anything away from it that you can use in your own garden, including the scaled layouts if they're helpful. There was a lot of content to cover in this one, and I tried not to get into the nitty-gritty details too much, but if there's a question I did not answer that you would like me to address, please throw it in the comments below and I will get back to you. Otherwise, I hope everybody else is having fun with the seed catalogs and buying too many seeds just like me, and I look forward to seeing your guys' gardens next year. Thanks.